From ignorance to light. Am I a Hindu? What's up with the word Hindu and Hinduism, and how is that significant to all of us? Hey, welcome to Easy Bhakti. If you're interested in spirituality and Indian religions and philosophies, then please do subscribe today so you don't miss anything. I've been practicing, Bhakti yoga for like 25 years. And so the question of whether or not I'm a Hindu or I'm not a Hindu is a question that I've been asking myself for 25 years. And for those of you who are, either starting to get interested in Indian religions or spiritualities that have their geographical root in India, or for those of you who are already, anchored and invested in X, Y, or Z spiritual tradition that, identifies itself with India, that question is also really, really important for you. Are we Hindus or are we not Hindus? What's up with the word Hinduism? What's really interesting, I think, is that the Supreme Court of India has defined someone as being a Hindu as someone who has faith in what's called the Vedas. And for those of you who don't know, the Vedas are a corpus of ancient texts written in Sanskrit, which include, the great epics like the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, which has the Bhagavad Gita in there, and all sorts of other branches of what's called Vedic wisdom, right? Including, for example, Ayurveda, the famous Ayurvedic medicine texts. So what's even more interesting is that when you look at the actual Sanskrit texts, right, that are thousands of years old, you do not find a single reference to the word Hindu or Hinduism. So it's like, you're trying to define yourself as a Hindu, and yet the texts that are supposed to be the foundation of your, identification as a quote-unquote Hindu doesn't mention anywhere the word Hinduism. So thousands of years ago, there's evidence that nobody in India, who practice what we can call today, quote-unquote Hinduism, or to be more precise, things like Sanatan Dharma, and I'll explain what that means a little later. None of these sort of indigenous ancient cultures and subcultures within India who followed the Vedas in general, none of them ever called themselves Hindu, or even call themselves Hindu vis-a-vis, the rest of the world. So neither internally among themselves, neither vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So that's really significant to remember. A lot of Hindus don't even know that. Now, the second part that's really interesting is when you fast forward to about the 16th century. And in India, you have, at that time, the Mughal influence, the Mughal invasion. Islam has basically invaded India, via Afghanistan. And this is where the history of the word Hindu and Hinduism comes in. As you know, there's a river in India called the Sindhu River. And history tells us that when the Muslim invaders came to India, when they got to that river called the Sindhu River, they started calling people who lived on the other side of the river and who were, following the Vedas, they called them by the name of the river. So they called them Sindhus. And with time and with pronunciation and language things, the S became an H. And so what started as the quote-unquote Sindhus became the Hindus, and that's how the word Hindu and Hinduism came about. Now, in those days, you have records of religious communities who are following the Vedas, in particular the Vaishnavas, for example, who start using the term Hinduism, but only when they're dealing with their oppressor, when they're dealing with the, Muslim invaders, who call them by that name anyway. So they're like, we're Hindus, no. But among themselves, in the sort of the intra-communal context, the word Hindu is never used to define, themselves. It's only used occasionally in conversation with, the other non-Vedic follower. You follow? Now, fast forward to about the 1800s, late 1800s, and this is where a big change with the word Hinduism comes about. A, by followers of Sanatan Dharma or the Vedas, and B, by, a growing, newly created academic category or an academic community, namely Indologists, or those who study India and Indian religions. In particular, I want you to go to 1893 at the first, the first Parliament of World Religions, some name like that, in Chicago, which is basically the first sort of international or really well-publicized interfaith sort of meeting where, representatives of different religions from around the world come. And remember, this is like just when industrialism is well on its way, and you've got, radio. I don't know if TV's there yet, but in other words, messages are starting to get really well and easily popularized. And in that context comes in Swami Vivekananda. Now, between you and me, or everyone knows, Swami Vivekananda belonged to what's called the Advaita Vedanta school, the non-dual school, all right? And this is where sort of his trickiness comes in, with all due respect, is that, he purported to represent Hinduism when in fact he was representing just one voice of the Hinduisms, we can call, right? So he's a full-on Advaita Vedantist. In other words, hold on, let me just readjust the microphone here. There's just one supreme white light, just a little bit of philosophy here. Non-dualism, which means basically there's no distinction between you and God. You are God, God is you. After liberation from, the cycle of birth and death, from samsara, you as an individual soul becomes one with, the divine it. And you merge into some sort of white, large, personality-less corporate, effulgence. And that's what's reality, right? So that's Advaita Vedanta. And speaking for Vaishnavism, speaking for Bhakti Yoga, there's a lot of other traditions out there within the greater umbrella of the word quote-unquote Hinduism, which don't ascribe whatsoever to this idea that we're all one, or that they ascribe to it, but they consider that realization to be secondary to the greatest or the ultimate realization of God as a person and the soul as a person. So imagine, I like to give this example, given that I'm from Los Angeles, I studied Native American religions a little bit, I was interested in them, I still respect them a lot, especially when it comes to ecology things. But imagine the fact is that there were different tribes, right? You had the Cherokees and Navajos, the this or that. So imagine if one smaller tribe among the Native Americans, let's say the Cherokees, okay? And they somehow got on some sort of world stage and they said, you know what? There is one religion among there's just one religion of the Native Americans. It's called, let's say, Gringoism. And, it's a word that none of our teachers for centuries, in our oral traditions have ever used, but let's just call it, Gringoism. And the belief of the Cherokees is the one and only religion of the Native Americans. Imagine if you were a Navajo and you were like, what? Wait a second, the Cherokees are much smaller in size than we are. And yet some Cherokee dude comes on stage and says that there's one religion and it's it and that's it, and we're supposed to belong in that sort of, representation. No way, we have different beliefs than the Cherokees. And why is this guy, appropriating or stealing the monopoly or stealing the show? Well, that's exactly what Vivekananda did. He used this term Hinduism in an attempt, sincere or not, I'm sure it was, I believe it was sincere, to sort of gather the tribes, so to speak, and say, you know what, we also only have one religion, and, it happens to be Advaita Vedanta, but, we're not going to tell anybody. We're just going to call it Hinduism. You know what I mean? And so there you go. And from that, you have the world of academic study of Indian religions who kind of run with it. And that's why for decades and decades and decades, it's changing now. For the last couple of maybe 20, 30 years, it's changing. But for literally almost a century or two, if you took a class in some university on Hinduism, Introduction to Hinduism, you'd basically be fed one tradition, namely Advaita Vedanta. Hinduism is polytheistic. They believe in many gods, and ultimately the goal is moksha or mukti, liberation from the cycle of birth and death, and merging into some, Brahman, impersonal white light. That's Hinduism, When in fact, for centuries and centuries and millennia, all the way back to the Mahabharata times, you have all sorts of different traditions with different theological conclusions, some of them really different from one another. All sort of claiming some sort of interpretation of this corpus of texts called the Vedas. And among all those different groups, you have the Vaishnavas, who historically have been by far the majority, tradition. Proof being, if you're not happy with what I just said, as I mentioned at the beginning, I was talking about, the epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which have created millions and millions of works of art and literature and music and dance and you name it, culturally speaking, all throughout South Asia and beyond. Those two epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, are clearly Vaishnava texts, because Vishnu, in either the avatar of Ramachandra or Krishna himself, are the central heroes of both epics. So those two most important texts, let's say, of Hindu India, quote unquote, are clearly Vaishnava texts. And come 1893, you have this dude or this guy or this whatever, this sannyasi Vivekananda, who comes and says, actually, in India, there's only one religion. It's called Hinduism, and we all Hindus believe that God has many forms, but ultimately it's all formless, and you and I are God, right? So that's the history of the word Hinduism in short. So what do you do? Like, if you're just starting to become interested in Indian religions, or if you're already, a practitioner of some sort of quote-unquote Hindu tradition, what do you do? Like, when you're speaking to the world, when you're speaking to family members, when you're speaking to friends, when you're speaking to whatever, newspaper interviewers, do you call yourself a Hindu or not? What's the answer? Well, the answer is a yes and a no. And in order to discriminate between when do you say yes and when do you say no, there's a very nice tool that you should learn, and that is the tool of discriminating between two categories of discourse or two levels of communication, right? And they have a Sanskrit word. One is called Vyavaharika, and the other is Paramartika. The former is having to do with temporary of this world kind of talk, and the second one, the latter, having to do with eternal sort of theological concepts of the self in terms of the universe and God, etc. So the Vyavaharika consideration is, for example, when you go and fill out a form to get a new passport, you have to write your name and your age, for example, and the country you were born. So on that form, for example, you're going to answer in Vyavaharika fashion, in temporary, of this world kind of fashion, and you're going to say, yeah, my name is Nancy, or my name is, Gopal, or my name is whatever, Sanjit, and my last name is Gupta, or Johnson, or Dupont, right? And your age is, whatever your body's age is, I'm 32, or I'm 25, right? And my country is wherever you were born, Sweden, or Australia, or India. If you filled out that form and wrote, when it's asking, your name, and you say, I don't have a name because I am a soul, and your age, I'm eternal, I have no age because the soul is eternal. What country you were born in? In this incarnation, my body was born in America, but actually I have no land. I belong to the universe and to God. You wouldn't be able to get your passport. People think, what, is this dude or is this woman crazy? You know what I mean? So in the similar way, historically speaking, we see, especially starting in the 16th century, people who followed the Vedic culture or the Vedic teachings used the word Hinduism in a sort of Vyavaharika consideration when dealing with the Muslim invaders, with, saying, yeah, that's who we are, okay, whatever, leave us alone, right? But among themselves, when they really spoke about what they believed to be like the eternal fundamental truths, they would never use the word Hinduism. So similarly today, let's say you're speaking to an academic a professor, or someone who just wants to know about the history of the spiritual Indian tradition you follow. In that sort of context, then you can say, I am a Hindu. I fall into the academic category of Hinduism, which is here to stay. So if you want my honest answer in terms of sort of academic categories of the 21st century, yeah, I am a Hindu. And particularly I'm a Shaivite Hindu, or I'm a Vaishnava Hindu, or I follow the Bhakti tradition of Hinduism, or I'm a Smarta Hindu. And furthermore, I'm a Gujarati Hindu, or I'm an American Hindu, or I'm a French Hindu Vaishnava. You can qualify it, but the general category of Hindu is there to stay. It's in the academy. It's all the books written on quote unquote South Asian religions has Hinduism as the basic, overall umbrella, and that's here to stay. And so to deny that, to say, for example, yeah, I follow the Bhagavad Gita, but I have nothing to do with Hinduism, from a Vyavaharika point of view, from a sort of a temporary this worldly kind of point of view, people would be like, what? Like, I remember, I'll tell you really quickly a story. When I was a monk, when I adopted Krishna Bhakti and kind of went full force and actually became a monk for some years and, you know, flipped out my parents. I remember I went for lunch at my parents' house in Paris. My dad and my stepmom, because my real mom was in Los Angeles. So I was having lunch with my dad, my stepmom, and you know, I was like in full on like monk regalia, and my father, who was educated, he was like, okay, well, you've converted to Hinduism, haven't you? And I had sort of been, you know, told that no, Vaishnavism, Bhakti is beyond Hinduism, and in a real sense it is. And I was like, no, Dad, I have nothing to do with Hinduism. I'm not at all practicing Hinduism. He was like, what are you talking about? You're reading the Bhagavad Gita. Of course you're following a Hindu tradition. And I was like, no, not at all. This has nothing to do with Hinduism. And he was like, okay, whatever, you know. So I should have said, yeah, you know, actually you're right, you know. But there's actually a deeper belief, Dad. And this is where you can qualify or full on start with the following, especially when you're dealing with someone who is not so much concerned with, you know, temporary labels, you know, as described in academic or political circles, but actually things that you actually believe. And here, for example, in the case of Bhakti, or Krishna Bhakti or Bhakti Yoga, no, I'm not a Hindu. We're not a Hindu. You're not a Hindu. You don't belong to any sort of designation. You're not even Indian or American or French or black or white or rich or poor. Any sort of label that has to do with this temporary body, you're not. According to the Bhagavad Gita, Mamaivam Sho Jiva Loke Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. You are an eternal part and parcel of Krishna, or God. And that's your eternal identity. And that identity, that title, quote unquote, is totally legit and eternal. It's not a temporary Vyavaharika consideration. It's a paramartha. It's like the ultimate consideration, kind of truth, right? At least that's what I believe, and that's what people who are following the Vedas believe. In greater or lesser degrees, with differences, you know, are we all God? Are we servants of God? That's the difference between, for example, the Advaita Vedantas and the Bhakti Yogis, right? But essentially believing that we're not our bodies, that we are spiritual beings inside physical bodies. In the case of the Bhakti tradition, that we're servants, eternal servants of Krishna, and that Krishna is the Supreme Lord. That kind of definition totally trumps, you know, this little temporary word called Hinduism, which came about, you know, with some invaders who invaded India a few centuries ago. And the word is, you know, floats around in academic mundane circles, you know. In the greater scheme of things, if you take, you know, the yugas or the cycles of years of cosmological time, you know, that expands into millions and millions of years, the word Hindu and Hinduism is just a little, you know, a little bleep, a little blip, a little, you know what I mean? It's just a tiny little flash in this greater eternal time. And so in that sense, no, we have absolutely nothing to do with the word Hinduism, which is just a created term that has just a few seconds of lifespan and probably won't last very long. So I hope you enjoyed this explanation. I hope that now you can, you know, walk through the world with a clearer understanding of what the word Hinduism means and where you belong in it. If you like the video, please do subscribe. It does help. And remember, we are much more than our minds and our bodies.